Thank you so much, Jade, for joining us today. I'm really, really excited and honored to have someone from Color of Change joining us. You are doing such amazing work when it comes to anti-racism, diversity, equity, inclusion. So really excited to hear about your campaigns and the work that you individually do. So to kick it off, I'd love for you to share, tell us a little bit about yourself and the work that you do.
Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here today. My name is Jade Magnus Ogunnaike. I'm the Senior Director of the Media, Culture, and Economic Justice team at Color of Change. And I've been at Color of Change for about 4 years, initially starting as an entry-level campaign manager. On our team, we lead all sorts of campaigns. Some of them sort of maybe most noteworthy ones are blood money, when we got payment processors to no longer process donations for white nationalist organizations. Last November, we led an effort convincing 5 wedding websites to no longer feature plantation weddings content. And this summer, we've been doing a ton of work, from COVID response work, pushing out some interesting, thought leadership work on universal basic income and how important that is as we're entering into a financial depression, to trying to deal with the effects of Zoom bombing. So many people are forced to live their social lives online these days. And unfortunately, Zoom was not properly handling the way that people were sort of intercepting people's conversations and meetings. And so we convinced Zoom to hire their first ever chief diversity officer, who's working on a number of issues around diversity and equity. Finally, this summer, we launched our campaign hub, Beyond the Statement. And it's a set of campaigns designed to push corporations past, Black Lives Matter statements into sort of real world application of the principles of Black Lives Matter. So, yeah.
Awesome. And I'd even love to get into that, but I'll take a step back. I think the thing that's really interesting about the work that you all do is we're talking definitely about how to build an anti-racist organization and integrate diversity, inclusion, and equity practices, but taking a step back, these organizations operate in a much larger context, right? So we're kind of thinking about how do you just create a just economy as a whole? So would love to talk about some of the other campaigns, but let's start there. I've been talking with a lot of people about talking about how when this social unrest that occurred in 2020, especially with Black Lives Matter, a lot of companies put the black square on social media, et cetera, but it wasn't that they were actually doing anything internally. So I'd love to hear about what does that campaign look like and how are you having organizations and businesses make those changes?
Yeah, the term of just economy is something that's really interesting. It's something that we think a lot about and run a lot of campaigns on at Color of Change. I mean, the facts of the matter are that, we live in a capitalist society, and in capitalism, there have to be winners and there have to be losers. The challenge in creating a just society is that or just economy, is that we would have to redo almost every single function of the way that corporations and government interact with each other and how they work. I think if, folks are starting businesses or starting organizations, there's something quite simple that people can do. And it's the heart of our Beyond the Statement campaign, but it's really about ensuring that all employees are receiving a living wage. The most interesting thing about, sort of the black squares and the Black Lives Matter statement is that we want Black lives to matter not only in death, but also in life. And so that means the material conditions that Black people live in matter, and the material conditions that all low-wage workers live in matter. We live in an incredibly prosperous country. I mean, that's the messaging that we receive. But during the coronavirus pandemic and social unrest, food banks are packing out. People are in need of food. Unemployment is, reaching unforeseen highs, and we're sure to enter into a depression, an economic depression. And so the flip side of that is that we see billionaires, getting even richer. During the coronavirus pandemic, Amazon's Jeff Bezos is reported to probably be projected to become the world's first trillionaire, right? And so it's a very stark contrast. I'm sure that, maybe folks aren't leading companies or organizations as big as Amazon, but I think it's really, really worthwhile to look at what the standard is for pay. I mean, employers in the form of corporations and organizations are in a very unique position in that you set the tone for how your employees actually live. You set the tone for whether they have enough money after paying rent to put food on the table. You set the tone for whether they can afford to buy toilet paper and hand sanitizer. and spend time with their children on the weekends. And so, racial justice cannot be divorced from economic justice. And it's incredibly important that when we're having this racial analysis, we're also having a class analysis. It's not okay that people are struggling when there are trillionaires and billionaires that are profiting off of us in this country.
Yeah, and I think, unfortunately, all COVID and one of the impacts and side effects was kind of shining a light. It's not that people didn't know, but it's more people hopefully know and then also see the economic injustice and the racial injustice that's happening and the gaps between the haves and the have-nots. And I think the other thing you're sharing or you're making me think about is within this capitalist system, I think it's forcing us, and hopefully we continue to question, it's like, what's the purpose of work and what's the purpose of companies? Not simply just making money for those people that you just mentioned, but what does that look like?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think an idea that I've heard floated during coronavirus more than ever is this idea around universal basic income, which I named earlier. We don't live in an industrial era. The 40-hour work week is a bit outdated. How can we ensure that people have what they need, even when they may not be hitting markers of productivity? We are in a very interesting time in history. I think the protests probably would not have received as much attention. And I don't think the deaths of Breonna Taylor and Tony McDade and George Floyd would have received as much attention if people weren't forced to sort of sit down at home, not rush off to work, not rush off to the bar, but sort of really take a look at what's going on all around us. There is an overlay of a class problem over these police killings too. Obviously rich Black people and middle class Black people experience incredible indignity with interactions with the police. But we can't miss the fact that George Floyd died over a possible forged check at a grocery store. These deaths are just highlighting so many of the historical class and race challenges that we've had since the very beginning.
Yeah, and the concept of a universal basic income, again, having organizations and companies recognize that, yes, there's work that's trying to be done internally, but they don't operate in a vacuum. They operate in an overall economic system. And both organizations and economic systems are made up of people, right? And if a huge chunk of those people, are not doing well, are stressed economically, it's not only going to impact them and kind of society as a whole, but it does impact the businesses also. So we just have to really think on a much broader scale when it comes to what's the purpose of work and the purpose of companies.
No, absolutely. I mean, what you just hit on, it makes perfect sense. The ways that racial justice and economic justice play off of each other is incredibly important. And I think, we're in a moment where racial justice, we're not in a moment. America is founded on racial injustice and anti-Black terrorism and racism, and anti-Indigenous people terrorism and racism. But we're in a moment where I think racial justice is being talked about in a big way. I think the seeds were planted, probably in 2013 when Trayvon Martin was killed, and slowly but surely, due to media attention, I think the work of social media cannot be denied. Seeing the ways that Black people have consistently been killed simply for existing over and over again, seeing it on Twitter, seeing it on Facebook, and on the news has created an environment where I think this has been the turning point for many people to, understand and realize that it's a problem. But, I said it earlier, and I would just want to reinforce is that Black lives don't only matter in death, they also matter in life. And it's incredibly important that all people in this country are given the resources they need to survive and also thrive. Everyone should be able to lay down in a bed in a house that's comfortable and safe, eat a meal that's healthy and good, and send their child to school in a space where they know that their child's being educated and affirmed. Those are basic human rights, and Black people deserve them, and all people deserve them. So yeah.
Absolutely. And kind of going back to the Beyond the Statement, what do those campaigns typically look like? How do they function? And I'm curious, just like that type of work and how have companies responded to those types of campaigns?
Yeah, So, beyond the statement, the idea came from just sort of like being a little disturbed at how companies like McDonald's were saying Black Lives Matter, but not only do they like pay their low wage workers who are disproportionately Black poverty wages, they also, a recent lawsuit came out from Black franchisees, aspiring Black entrepreneurs, starting McDonald's franchises and being treated horribly and exploited by the company. And so, we began initially talking about wages. We sent a letter to Target, saying, hey, you need to make these temporary coronavirus wages permanent. You are a $1 billion company. I think a few days later, they announced that they would be making them permanent. But another thing, and I think it's something that companies really should look into, especially if they've been around for a while, is we think it's incredibly important for corporations and organizations to undergo civil rights audits. So it's something that Color of Change first pushed Facebook to do a few years ago. I believe in 2018, we pushed Facebook to do their first civil rights audit, but it's important for all sorts of organizations. It's important to see how disparity and bias are showing up on every level. If you look at a company like Disney, right, it's such a huge company. You may have people working in Disney stores making $9 an hour, $10 an hour. You may have people in Disney corporate who maybe are not hiring, Black creators to write screenplays and things like that. There are just so many different ways that disparity and bias show up on every level of companies. And so we think that the civil rights audit is a really, really great first step. Find out the ways that your company is falling short. It's a diagnostic sort of thing so that you can know what to fix. I think the sort of impulse is to look at what's happening and say, hey, we're going to donate some money to a Black organization. That's great. Always want donations to Black organizations. But what about the Black people actually in your company? How are they being treated? What about the low wage workers in your company? How are they being treated? Again, donations are great, but wages are much more important. You see Adidas make a claim to put millions and millions of dollars into Black organizations. But, there was a report that came out a few years ago about how I think 55 or 65% of their retail staff are non-white and they get paid horribly. Why not put that money into your employees and make sure that they have a real standard of life?
Absolutely. Can you share a little bit about, that's interesting, I never heard about the civil rights audit. Can you share a little bit about what that is? And you're making me think of a couple other diagnostics that organizations can use, but what's the civil rights audit?
Yeah, so what Facebook ended up doing a civil rights audit because they had hired a PR firm to smear Color of Change, right? So they had hired a PR firm to smear our organization and spread tons of anti-Black and anti-Semitic tropes all over the internet. So when that came out, it came out in the New York Times article. Yeah, they were sort of forced into having a negotiation with us. Facebook is a company that in many ways is shrouded in secrecy, as many corporations and organizations are, right? How many of us can name like the president of Coca-Cola off the top of our head, or the vice president of Disney? These are, they're made up of people, as you said earlier. And so the purpose of the civil rights audit with Facebook was to see what are the ways that the product is biased. That's number one. And who are the sort of power players who are making decisions that are harming people. And so Facebook has undergone, I think, a set of 3 since that happened in 2018. And, we're in talked with a lot of other really large companies to do them as well. Again, it's impossible for any one person to know all of the ways that bias is showing up. There's just no way anyone can name all of the ways. And it's important for there to be a diagnostic way to sort of explore those things so that we have space and areas to fix them.
Yeah, that's great. I appreciate that you shared that. And is it something that you all created or someone else created?
I mean, a civil rights audit is not a Color of Change sort of product, no. And we actually don't do civil rights audits, but we are always happy to recommend civil rights auditors who can sort of help organizations figure it out.
Yeah, because you're making me think about organizations and even like individuals and companies. So there is, and I'm not sure if you're familiar with B Corps. And so that's a really great diagnostic to show overall how you're doing in terms of being a socially conscious or social impact company. But sometimes it's hard within a large organization. The other is that sometimes the organization might be too far along in the opposite of that. So they need something more specific that could hopefully ignite change. And it's interesting that for our listeners out there that there are such things as civil rights audits.
Yeah, I mean, I think we know that by nature, corporations exploit people. It's just sort of the nature of the way that they're set up, and even organizations, even nonprofit organizations can be exploitative. It's just sort of how human power dynamics happen, right? And so it's not a fail to look at your company or organization and say, hey, I think we should do an audit. It's not a bad thing. It's actually the start of a good thing. We don't want, the reason we named it Beyond the Statement is because we don't want just the Instagram meme. We want people to commit to it for the long haul. In 6 months, maybe people won't be talking about Breonna Taylor or George Floyd, but the inequities in the world are still going to exist, and we need to be working. There are people in every corporation who have great intentions and want to change things. We've seen that at Facebook. We've seen it at every company. People are moved to make things better. And so I think the civil rights audit is a really, really great place to start.
Yeah, and you brought up a really important point in kind of thinking about the spectrum of businesses and companies in our economic system, where you have like startups, medium-sized businesses, and then large corporations. And as you pointed out, the economic kind of systems and policies are set up so that it's not always thinking necessarily about its people and really about exploitation. The other is that completely public companies are purely about that, with a pure focus on making financial bottom lines and that's kind of the core thing. And I appreciate and you all taking on these large companies to help make those type of changes. And can you share a little bit? Okay, I guess I'll take a step back. As one of the organizations that are leading this change, how have things shifted for you all externally and even internally with the social unrest that's happened in 2020 as well as the pandemic?
Yeah, so I started at Color of Change 4 years ago. My first big campaign was Quit the Council. I ran a campaign demanding that Uber's CEO at the time, Travis Kalanick, sorry if I pronounced his name wrong, dropped from Trump's business council. If y'all remember, it was the middle of the Muslim ban, and taxi drivers were striking in support of the Muslim ban, the very racist and Islamophobic Muslim ban that Trump put out. And Uber sent forth, they reduced surge rates so that prices were lower and they could undercut the taxi drivers. There was huge social media, outcry. Delete Uber was trending, and we went right to Uber and Travis Kalanick and demanded that that he drop from Trump's business council, and he did. We talked to him on a Monday. He dropped by Thursday. And so Color Change has a long history of corporate sort of, I don't want to use a responsibility work. I think the word is accountability work.
Yeah.
We know that, corporations are not magically going to turn into co-ops. But any space or intervention we can to make them better for the people who work there or better for all of us who interact in society where corporations have outsized influence, that's important work for us to do. And so we've consistently run corporate accountability campaigns for the past, at least, 8 years since before I was there. And what we saw during the civil unrest were a lot of corporations who had refused to make commitments to us about changing things reach back to have a second conversation. Again, I think corporations were very, very focused on, the racial justice piece. I really want to talk to Black people. That's sort of, who's the Black organization we have a connection to? That was sort of it. And so we've had second touches and fruitful conversations with corporations to push them to do things from civil rights audits, raising employee wages, et cetera. I mean, I think externally we've grown from 1.7 million members, so almost 2 million members, to nearly 7 million members. So, we're seeing our list grow. We're seeing people be interested in things like, on our at Color of Change PAC, we do district attorney races, on our PAC program, being interested in all of the ways that criminal justice and economic justice and racial justice intersect. And, internally, we sort of have these tragic moments happen a couple times a year. There's always, usually in the summer, it's something awful that happens, Charlottesville, There's always something sort of horrific that happens in the summer, and we're seeing a much more sustained interest, and we hope that interest is a values change and not just like an attention change. We understand that things will be going back to normal, whatever normal looks like, maybe in a year, maybe 6 months, maybe 8 months, but we find that from the new members that we have, from the new people who are interested in like joining hands in this fight with us, it's a difference in priority. People are looking at all the ways that racism and anti-Black racism has shown up in every aspect of their lives. From maybe they were in school and learned about slavery and learned that it was more, there was a textbook that said it was like an internship. Maybe that was something that they learned. Maybe they had a wedding on a plantation. Maybe they have been treating an employee that they have who's Black in a way that they feel a little bit embarrassed about, and they're sort of reflecting on why that is. We're seeing the ways that our new members and the people who are joined hands with us in this fight are shifting their values, and it's really meaningful.
Yeah, and going back to the work that you're doing with companies, who are the people that you're typically engaging with or have been the most welcoming of engaging with you or responding to the campaigns? Because I'm thinking about listeners who are thinking about wanting to make some kind of change, and who do they go to within their organizations that are going to try to help shift the way the organization is doing business?
Yeah, so I think it's dependent on sort of like what we're talking about. So with tech, I always think it's important that we have like CEOs in the room and product people in the room. Often because we're a Black group, people think, oh, let me bring in like HR or diversity. And like, my mother is like a diversity and equity practitioner, nothing against diversity and equity. But it's really important that we have decision makers from other departments as well, who can sort of tell us what's really going on with the product or have power over an entire organization. We want to meet people in leadership and people who have decision-making power. We're not necessarily interested in people who are sort of going to just like pass the company motto to us and sort of, pass us off. We always want to talk to people who have decision-making power in companies. So I would say product people, we like to have DEI people in the room, and, executives, COOs, et cetera.
Yeah, and I think you're pointing out some interesting and important things. And hopefully, as we've been talking with DEI people as well as kind of CSR, and I love corporate social accountability people, is that those people can and should be in the room, but at the end of the day, it's kind of the decision makers that might be above that. And you also have to take a look at the context of where that sits in your organization. And is it simply just a side thing and it's just been kind of something that needs to be done? Or is it a core part of the business? And can you shift it to the core part of business? But a lot of that has to come from the leadership and buy-in from the leadership.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, what we find a lot of times with corporations and organizations that we reach out to is that, I think blood money is a prime example of that. We had reached out to payment processors about processing white nationalists, white supremacist donations, like maybe January. Charlottesville happened in August, and they had totally passed us off. They'd ignored us. We told them that the growing white nationalism was a problem. They weren't interested, and they weren't interested until Charlottesville. And when that happened, all of a sudden, it was a big rush to change things. And, I'd say, don't be that company. Don't be that organization. If someone is like ringing an alarm about something that's going on at your company or organization, listen and do what you can do to like bring a solution to the problem. It's always kind of disappointing when people come after the fact of something horrific happening in their company. So yeah.
Yeah. And do you feel like, thinking about being a color change for 4 years, do you feel there's a tipping point in 2020? Do you feel that companies are more open and more companies are open, and that's going to lead to kind of, I wouldn't say a landslide, but trying to think of tipping point of this being a new standard?
Yeah, I think 2020 is undeniably a tipping point in the ways that people understand race. I think in anti-Blackness, I think it's undeniably, for sure. I think the economic justice piece is really still missing. I've talked to a lot of companies who want to talk to me about like adding a Black person to their board, which, I think that's great, but I'm not, representation is not equity. We like Black faces in high spaces. Always great to have a diverse array of people like making decisions. But, what it really comes down to is pay and benefits. How are people at your company being treated? Particularly because we know that, work in the United States is racialized. You know, in my work as a union organizer for 2 years, I organized home health care aides in Northern California, which is some of the hardest work you can do. They're the people bathing your sick, ill, and elderly, you know, family members, talking to them, keeping them company, taking them to doctor's appointments. And in cities in the Bay Area where I was living, they actually, home health care aides and other domestic workers did not receive minimum wage increases when the rest of the city did, because those roles were considered they were typically racialized roles. Typically Black and brown women held those roles. So they did not benefit from minimum wage increases. And there are things that happen like that all across the country, in cities all across the country. You know, low wage work is racialized. Of course, there are many of working class low wage workers who are also white people. And it's really, really important that beyond racial justice, I'm sorry, that's horrible framing, not beyond racial justice, but with racial justice comes also economic justice.
Yeah, and I appreciate that. I keep appreciating that you keep coming back to this, because again, we're operating into an overall economic system, and there's definitely the organizations and companies themselves that need to make change, but the overall major systemic change is actually through this, and some of that is going to be driven by companies, and some of it's going to be also driven by policy and the people that we end up electing as well.
Absolutely. You know, elected officials have a lot of power over the stuff. And obviously the president and things like that, but also local city council people, mayors. These are all people who make decisions about things like pay. When I was organizing for higher wages, and, you know, I also worked on the Fight for 15, you know, I would have so many like business owners come in and say, well, I can't run a business and pay my employees a living wage. And it's like, well, maybe you don't have enough money to run a business. You know, it's not for everybody. If you can't afford to treat people with respect and dignity and equity, their livelihoods and their material conditions shouldn't come at the expense of your dream. So yeah.
Absolutely. And I've been talking with a lot of startups and a lot of people who are starting businesses. And again, that's reframing what does a business look like in its purpose, and really thinking about, there's like product, services, there's operations, there's all these elements that make up a business, and reframing, okay, I need to pay a living wage to my employees. That's an essential part of the business, right? I need to think about culture and think about diversity, justice, diversity, equity, diversity and inclusion, so that JEDI kind of framework, and make sure this is here from the beginning, and not, so I think you're pointing out that they may not have the money to operate a business because these things aren't necessarily part of it. So I think it's also reframing, what a business looks like.
Yeah, and I think, you know, talking about how, you know, employment can be racialized. I mean, one thing that we see a lot in tech is like the contract worker workforce. You know, there's so many people, you know, you can go to like Google, and, you know, there's so many people who are like, have access to all these benefits and making great money. And then you look at the security workers or the people serving the food in the cafeterias, and even many professional, you know, quote unquote professional class workers who don't have those benefits, and they're kept in these very tenuous, stressful contract worker positions where they don't have access to sort of the benefits of progressivism that tech companies tout. So yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And you've been sharing a little bit about this. Would love to hear, what are some of kind of your career path, and what do you feel are some of the skills and experiences that you've had that have really benefited your work at Color of Change?
You know, I think labor organizing, well, first of all, I went to Howard University, which is an HBCU. So, you know, I had a fantastic education, a Black-centered education that was fantastic in teaching me like the history and the theory, which I think is like, it's important. But I would say by far, probably the most impactful experiences I've had are being a founding member of BYP 100. It's an activist-based organization. So if there's an activist-based organization near you, you should join if you feel like the values align with you. And I think it's important because I think that it's important to be able to have a space to discuss things with other people in real life, and not just on like Twitter and Reddit and Facebook, to discuss theory, to discuss like ways that you might show up. And also, it's important to be accountable to other people in this fight. It's a long haul thing. You need comrades, you need friends who you can like bounce ideas off of. And you also need like loving environments where you can be told that you're wrong. You know, that that comes with building relationship with people who have similar values to you. And in addition to that, I would say like my labor organizing experience was priceless. Meeting workers, organizing workers and hearing their stories is a forever like life-changing experience. You know, I'm in touch with many of like the members that I worked with at the union to this day. But training, you know, I think that politics and organizing and things like that are sort of things that people think, oh, anyone could do it because it's something that everybody has an opinion on, right? But in reality, it requires a lot of training and a lot of learning and a lot of relationship building. And it's something serious to take on, you know, it's not, and everyone's not going to be an organizer. Everyone's not going to be an activist. Maybe some people are just like the people who say, hey, I'm going to donate $10 monthly to the organization of my choice. That's also great. Everyone needs, you know, people fulfill different roles in this like long haul movement. But I definitely think that like, if this is something that you feel called to do, don't be afraid of being wrong. Don't be afraid of like messing up and learning. Like find an activist group where you can get some training and some relationship building and discussion.
Yeah, I love that combination of everything you described. It's going to learning theory, ideas, and taking in that information, but also doing it within community. And I think the other element of that sharing is also listening and sharing stories and getting and that's going to be an important, that you can only do in relation with others, and hearing both people that share the same values and also opportunities of possibly connecting with people that necessarily don't or are questioning. And I think that story sharing is super important as well in terms of your learning journey.
Yeah, I mean, we love social media. It's like given, you know, public voice to so many people who like didn't have access to large swaths of people in audiences before. It's amazing, but you know, it's important that like our discourse moves beyond like 140 characters. It's important that like the conversations we have are longer than like a Facebook status, and the sort of like, I feel like the word polarizing is overused, but it is. It's a really polarizing sort of experience on social media to like learn. It's not, social media is not the best place to like interact and learn. That's really done best with like other people. So yeah.
Awesome. And I've loved this discussion and would love to hear, what do you all have, if you can share, are there things that you have coming up in the new year, in the next 6 months or in the new year? And maybe it has 2020 shifted at all or provided opportunities for new types of work at Color of Change?
Yeah. So, you know, I would say like, be a member of Color of Change, sign a petition, you know, go to colorofchange.org and, you know, get looped in. I think like, you know, we always have so many projects and campaigns that are going. I think beyond the statement is really, really what we're focused on in this moment, right? It's like holding corporations accountable, pushing them beyond what's comfortable to ensure like economic equity to everyone who works there. I think that's sort of our big thing. But, you know, we also have, we're running some campaigns on the debates. You know, we're concerned about some of the framing. You know, the debate last night was wild. But, you know, one of the sections that the moderator, Chris Wallace, prepared was called like race and violence. And it's a bit confusing about why like those two things were paired. We're always running these sort of like culture campaigns. Our Facebook work continues. You know, last night during the election, Donald Trump told the Proud Boys, a group, white nationalist group that Color of Change has like been running campaigns on for forever, to stand by, and also told like, that goes along with his son's, you know, Facebook ads that he's been pushing, which tell people to enlist in the Trump army, you know, around voting and creating an environment of intimidation and terror around the right to vote. It's quite disturbing. So running campaigns on that. But one thing I truly love about working out with Color of Change is we're not a single issue org. Pretty much anything that impacts Black people, that affects low income communities, we are doing something about it, from environmental justice to criminal justice to voting rights. So please, you know, stay in the loop with Color of Change, sign petitions. I know people think like petitions don't matter. They totally do. Petitions and being able to say 50,000 people agree with us on this issue is something that has shifted so, you know, more campaigns than I can say. So sign those petitions, share them, and yeah, stay in the loop. Find your community that you can build relationship with.
Yeah, and thank you so much for all the amazing work that you individually and Color Change is doing. It's for listeners, it's a super simple thing for you to do in terms of going on and getting updates at colorofchange.org. But I think you pointed out, one, there's a variety of issues. So it's a huge opportunity to start learning about all of these different issues and start putting together all the different elements that are making and creating this injustice. I think the second is that thinking about the overall just economy, where we have private companies, we have government, and then we have nonprofits, and advocacy organizations like yourself that create important connective tissue and hold companies accountable. And that's so important if we're going to be making change moving forward.
Yeah, thank you so much. There are a lot of levers in this like change ecosystem, like you said, from elected officials to private companies to public companies to advocacy organizations like ourselves to unions to the regular people who show up at school board meetings and city council meetings to make sure their needs are met. Everyone can't do everything, but plugging into the space that you feel like you're meant to be in is incredibly important. So thank you so much.
And thank you so much, Jade, for all the amazing work you're doing, and tell your staff congratulations as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Have a wonderful day.